About 6 months ago, I was discussing how amazing it was that Pokemon anime was still running after all these years with a friend of mine. Although I still try to catch it every weekend, this friend had ceased watching back at one of Johto's seasons due to finding the series repetitive. The final straw, though, he said, elaborating on why he no longer watched the series, was an episode that was basically a snuff film. Understandably, I scoffed at this premise. You can't seriously tell me that they released a Pokemon snuff cartoon. Well, you're wrong. He went on to explain that it was a lost episode, not too far from a stretch of imagination, seeing as how there were already several episodes that had been given that title. He said it was the sickest thing he had ever seen, and that it gave him nightmares, quote unquote, for a long time. He refused to share the contents of the episode, but instead offered the VHS he had somewhere in the back of this closet, claiming that I wouldn't believe him unless I saw it for myself. I had heard about other popular cartoons having legendary unaired episodes that were reportedly uncharacteristically disturbing, such as Suicide Mouse and Dead Bart. However, the only evidence of those ever existing were poorly made YouTube videos by fans of these stories. I figured this was simply Pokemon's version of such. After a month and a half went by before I saw my friend again, true to his word, he delivered the videotape, but promptly left, not wishing to stick around for the viewing. Looking the tape over, I noticed nothing strange, save for the fact that it was unlabeled. Already I was getting chills, having learned the potential horrors of an unmarked video cassette from the Ring. I decided to press on and watch it anyway. After all, what was the worst that could happen? Some amateur production of Ash screaming and his face melting? I inserted the tape into my VCR, and it started right up like most store-bought shows and films would. Initially, I thought perhaps that this was just a standard Pokemon VHS with the label removed. Immediately, though, I knew it was something different when a grainy Japanese title appeared on the screen. The quality was terrible, like the millionth generation fan sub of Dragon Ball Z I had seen as a youth. There was no opening theme, just the screen with barely legible Hungarian. What I believed to be Meowth's voice actor shouted his title. My Japanese was very rusty, and the sound quality was lousy, so the only word that I caught was possibly Kijoro. After a few seconds, the title vanished and was replaced by an extreme close-up of Ash's face, sideways. And what I believed to be a result of the trashy video quality, it looked like Ash's eyes were wide open, yet completely blank. I soon realized that there may have indeed been blank when, as the focus slowly zoomed out from his face, it was clear that there was a trickle of blood emerging from his right temple. I cocked my eye in confusion. The scene changed to that of James, a sinister grin on his face, or at least what I thought could have been, considering the fact that the video quality was so terrible that I couldn't be sure if I was making out all the details correctly. What was perfectly clear was that he held a pistol in his hand. James said something that sounded like he was gloating. Again, because of my poor knowledge of anything outside of basic Japanese, and the abysmal sound quality, I wasn't able to make out anything he said. But the voice actor sounded entirely different. More of a deep voice. Uncannily like Unisori Murasaki fused villain in the Dragon Ball animated special Osu Son Goku and His Friends Return. There was another shot of Ash's body, and it was definite that he had been shot in the head. The blood had stopped actively trickling, but it was apparent that it had pooled underneath them. Although the video quality made it tough to tell, it appeared as if the animation were on par with the rest of the series during the first season. If this was indeed a fake, it was a darn good one. The focus switched back to James, who had started some sort of wicked-sounding monologue. Jessie and Meowth emerged from the bushes after about 40 seconds. They take a look at Ash's corpse and started speaking, nigh simultaneously in rapid panic voices. James interrupted them with a laugh, putting a hand on his hip. He started gloating again, his chest puffed out with pride. Jessie started screaming at him. I caught Rikatu-dan, Team Rocket, and Yainai Yesu. It is not. But that was all. The scene then focused on an enraged James' face. The detail was still horrid, but it was clear that James was pissed. The focus zoomed out as he pointed his gun off-screen to the left, shouting, Shinai! 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 In essence, telling them to die. As clear as day, gunshot echoed from the speakers as Jessie took a bullet to the forehead. She stood looking upward as if trying to see the wound as a spurt of blood sprayed from the bullet hole. She slowly collapsed to her knees and then fell face first to the ground. Meowth yelled something that protracted his claws, leaping into the air with speed lines in the background. He was stopped shortly by a bullet to the abdomen. Meowth catapulted backwards as blood leaked from the wound. James laughed in triumph and ran off through a clearing in the forest. At this point, I had begun to wonder if this was indeed a legitimate production from the anime studio. What sort of sick minds would develop such a thing? At the very least, it was apparent that the roles of Jessie and Meowth were voiced by their usual seiyuu, which further complicated the matter. Why would they participate in such an odd production? The scene shifted to Ash again and Pikachu approaching the body. A happy shout of "Pika-Pee!" was soon followed by several confused repeated queries of "Pika-Pee?" It cut to a close-up of Pikachu's face as he realized what had happened, tears streaming down its face with a very depressing "Pika-Pee," and then outright crying. I began crying as well, feeling bad for this adorable fellow and a personal favorite character of mine who had just lost his best friend. I tried drying my tears as the scene shifted back to James, running through the forest. It appeared as if he had a wicked smirk on his face. I could hear his voice, which kind of had an echo to it, and since his mouth wasn't moving, I deducted that he was saying something. A few seconds later, Pikachu's very enraged voice cut through. James looked startled and had slipped behind a tree, his back pressed up against it. He continued thinking. His expression panicked for several seconds before his evil grin returned. Pikachu approached the tree, shouting angrily. James slipped out from behind the tree, pointing the gun at the mouse. "No!" I yelled. "You better not hurt Pikachu." I wanted to grab the remote and shut off the tape, or at least the TV. Unfortunately, my hands felt like two cold stones at the end of my arms, and I didn't think all of my willpower would have allowed them to move. Likewise, I was unable to look away. Before James could fire, however, Pikachu attacked him with an electrical attack, shouting out his catchphrase as he did, in the same enraged tone as he had been yelling at James with. The attack hit spot on, and instead of the goofy zapping animation that one had come to expect from Pikachu's attacks, James' hair and clothing began to catch fire, and he screamed the most inhumane scream I had ever heard. It didn't sound like any of the show's voice actors, including the new voices of James, but instead some sort of guttural yellow pain, like some sort of animal or monster. It began to zoom in on James as his hair began to thin from the fire, and his shirt had partially fallen off. His skin was charred, and he began to drop to his knees. The fire then ceased, and all that was left of James as he fell to the ground was a bald, cooked corpse with half of a shirt. Pikachu fired off 2 more electric attacks, yelling through its tears. This served no effect on James other than to cause him to flop a bit on initial impact. I was surprised to see Misty run into the patch of forest where Pikachu was standing. She ran up to Pikachu and said something, wrapping her arms around the little yellow mouse. Both of them began sobbing heavily, and the scene ended with Pikachu's tear-streaked face in a close-up. The cut to static startled me, especially since the entire production seemed to last not but 8 minutes total. I fast-forwarded to see if there was anything after the static, but there was nothing. I shut off the video and rewound it, putting my head in my hands, trying to decompress. I had definitely seen much worse than what had just occurred on my screen, but the fact that it was a Pokemon, or more or less wholesome show, that made it so disturbing. What really got me was seeing how sad Pikachu was. That in and of itself was depressing. About 10 minutes had passed before I decided to call the friend that I had lent me the tape. He refused to discuss the content, and the only question of mine he would answer was the origins of the tape. Apparently he had found it at random in a drawer of his, and had no idea how it had appeared there. There was an awkward silence for about a minute after this, before my friend spoke up again. "You didn't happen to see what was on 2 minutes 16 seconds, did you?" I replied in the negative, not recalling timestamps or anything that would have stood out. His response was, "Good. You don't want to." He then abruptly hung up. I knew that I should have heeded his warning, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped the tape on again and fast forwarded it to the 2 minutes in. Watching closely, I could definitely see something flash into the screen very briefly that I had missed before. Going back to the 10-minute mark, I advanced frame by frame until I came across the screen he had likely been referring to. One that nearly forced me to change pants. It was some sort of bear-like creature with spiraling goat-like horns. It was like no Pokemon I had ever seen, and strangely, this frame was much cleaner than the rest of the video, and the art style was vastly different, much more detailed and realistic, like an Alex Ross painting. The most terrifying part was that Brock was strung up on a tree across from the beast, and was pulling his intestines from a large gash in his gut. I knew not what this scene was supposed to represent, or what the monstrosity that had disemboweled Brock was, but I immediately ejected the tape and took a lighter to it, setting it on fire while praying over it. After the tape had melted successfully, I doused it with holy water and put out the flame. After it had cooled off enough to the handle, I threw it in an empty box I had lying around, and immediately ran outside and heaved it into the trash. And that, my little shadows, was Set It With a Bullet, a Pokemon Lost Episode creepypasta. My final thoughts on the story? I remember having narrated the story the first time around and actually relatively enjoying it. And looking back on it, while I can admit that there were a couple of cliches in the story that kinda was a little bit unsavory, the rest of the story actually played out rather well. Now, to be a little bit more specific on this one, the main thing I actually liked about this story was the fact of the matter that this was a really messed up kind of concept. Apparently about James sitting there and, ultimately killing Ash in the process of something, if I can even say that word anymore. Um, ultimately owning him in a sense by blasting his head with a freaking gun, which is screwed up in a lot of different ways, but still. I mean, there's a lot of questions that really come into the actual episode itself, but the main origin, more or less, of somebody actually finding this is, well, again, I do consider it to be rather cliched in a couple of manners, but ultimately speaking, it's not really as bad as I thought it would be. In fact, I would even go so far to say that it's actually, somewhat excusable in a sense. The VHS tape thing, while it has been done to death, it is likely that something like this could possibly happen. And this is obviously a thing with many cliches, is that regardless of how ridiculous it all is, it is in a sense somewhat realistic to, do some of the things that many cliches say you can do, like hyperrealism, for example. But ultimately, the whole thing itself was actually really good, but I also like the fact that the main episode itself actually had a bit of a sense of justice, with Pikachu finally getting at James and ultimately frying him to a crisp, in a sense. And I find that to be extremely a satisfying ending. A sad one, nonetheless, but still a relatively satisfying answer as well. Now, what I genuinely would have loved a lot more with this story is that if there was a little bit more of a beginning startup, so to speak. Mostly a good beginning on, what caused James to sit there and lose his mind. What caused him to sit there and kill Ash, in such a messed up kind of way. It's kind of hard to really say. I mean, if I had to make some kind of, how do I put this? If I had to make some kind of probable theory, it's most likely the fact that James had enough with Ash and all the others, and was ultimately going to do whatever he possibly could to sit there and finally stop, him from violating his plans. But if that was the case, I'm still a little bit surprised by Jesse and Meowth ultimately, well, how do I put this? Ultimately, being very much against what they were doing. And, that's a good thing, I guess. It's a good thing, because at least it shows that they have some aspect of morality in them. I mean, not saying they're not moral people, but yeah, it's a cartoon, people. But still, this was a pretty a good creepypasta, but there are a couple of negatives with the story that I do feel needs to be made a mention of. For one, the cliches within the story. I'm willing to excuse the VHS tape one because it is somewhat believable. However, the whole demon goat thing with, intestines being ripped out or things like that with Brock, was a really big oh. That's kind of how I ultimately felt when I read that part. In fact, there were even a couple of parts that I didn't really want to read, to be honest, but I made myself. But that part right there, I really kind of wish I didn't. That part was really unnecessary and didn't really provide anything but just like a cheap thrill, a cheap scare. I mean, maybe some of you might disagree with me on that, but personally for me, I just think it's a little bit more unnecessary in and of its own self to have that kind of concept in it. Now, does it completely kill the story? No, it doesn't. But another thing I actually can say that this is actually a major problem I have with with the story is that there's not much of a good conclusion with it. It just kind of more or less ends with what was it? It ultimately just ends with, heaved it into the trash, and then that's it. I mean, it would have been nice to have a little bit of an epilogue, so to speak, with it. I mean, I get it that the person had seen it, but there really isn't much of an ending to this, which is unfortunate. There could have been a decent epilogue, saying, about how the tape was screwed up, or whatever, or you never really know, it's... I don't understand this with creepypastas. Mostly lost episodes, but creepypastas in general. Why is it that a person feels the need to sit there and torch, burn, or get rid of, like, some kind of cartridge or whatever that a friend supposedly owns? I mean, regardless if it freaks them out or not, it's still not particularly right to sit there and do that without the person's permission. I know I'm discussing, morals or whatever on the matter of a creepypasta, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's the truth. I mean, there has to be an element of realism on that matter. I mean, it'd be one thing if the person said, go on ahead and burn it, then that would be understandable. But this person just seems to just sit there and take a match to it, and then, oh my god, the holy water and the prayers and all that. It's like, really? It's a VHS tape. It's not a demon. It's not like a devil crawling out of a tape, sitting there and wanting to rip your soul out and then go and turn it into soup in hell or something. I mean, that just... It doesn't work like that. I mean, it's one thing to sit there and burn the thing, which I still think is ridiculous, because I think that's a little bit more of a cop-out, so to speak. And I actually would go so far to, yeah, that is ultimately a cop-out decision of not having an excuse of showing the footage. And I'm not saying any of these creepypastas are real. None of them are, with a few exceptions, but ultimately... it's just not a real story, to be honest. But it would still be nice to have a bit of a realistic reasoning behind why exactly, somebody can't show the footage or isn't able to show the footage. And even if you just refuse outright to even show anything, that's a logical reasoning. I mean, burning and things like that, really? Why is it that every creepypasta has to result to burning stuff? I mean, I'm about as much of a pyro crazy person myself, but... I think these stories tend to, do that a bit too much. I'm completely rambling and I apologize for that, but overall, like I always say, this is simply my own personal opinion, and if you disagree with it, that's perfectly fine too. We're all entitled to our own opinions in regards to these creepypastas, and this is simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating of the story would have to be a 6 out of 10. It's a relatively decent creepypasta, but the cliches, the lack of ending, and overall, the ridiculousness more at the end kinda more or less did me a lot of negatives than positives. It's still a relatively decent creepypasta, but it definitely could use a little bit more of an improvement by removing the cliches and ultimately providing at least a small epilogue or something like that at the end. Something that more or less wraps everything up and is a satisfactory ending. But that's my own personal opinion. But what did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you guys enjoy it? Did you guys not? Also, what would you have personally done to help make the story a lot better? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I'm the Shadow Reader, thanks again for watching today's episode, and if you're brand new here to this channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because I make brand new videos every single day. And of course, like always, roll the outro because I'm out. In fear and surprise as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.